Good afternoon, good evening to those of you who are in the country and around the world. Welcome to Hashtag Power Up. I am excited to be with you all today. My name is Elder Daniel Parham, and I have the pleasure of being one of the co-hosts and producers of Hashtag Power Up. We are excited to have you here. Before we get started today, I would love for you to do a few things for me. I would like for you to love and share this live stream with your folks, kinfolks, church, family, friends, dignitaries, whoever you want to share this with. Please share it as we're excited to talk today about something that's dear to my heart, and I think it's an opportunity for us as a church to consider as a new means for the way the church can communicate and discuss beyond those four walls that is the local church. First, before we get started today on Hashtag Power Up, I would like to give honor to our leadership, both at the Presidium as well as the International Sunday School Department. We honor our international presiding bishop, the Bishop J. Drew Sheard, and we honor our general supervisor, Mother Barbara McCoo Lewis. Also, for the Sunday school leadership, we honor President Mark Ellis and Mother Cleolia Penix as our field representative for the International Sunday School Department. We are excited today to jump into a topic that we haven't talked extensively about here on Hashtag Power Up. Excited for the conversation we're going to have today about podcasting. For my TAC and LEAP friends, you know what you can do right now. You can put in your cohort, tell us where you're coming from as well, both jurisdictionally and in the cohorts that you are from. I'm excited today because we're going to be talking about podcasting. If you listen to a podcast, tell me what podcasts you listen to or podcasts you have listened to in the chat. Or if you're curious about podcasts, give me a thumbs up in the chat. Today, we're going to talk about podcasting, which is one of the many mediums that you can use to communicate your voice. And I really want to think about some of the questions that pop up and arise from the life of the church and broader culture and society. Podcasting is one of those mediums, almost kind of hearkening back to the days of radio, but more of a discourse, a discussion that we're able to have in these mediums. I'm not going to be the one running my mouth the whole time. I have a partner here that's going to be joining me. We are excited to have Sister Jasmine Gates on with us today. She is not a stranger to us. She has joined us before. She is a content creator herself. She's the content creator and coordinator and founder of New Black History Makers. She also serves within the jurisdiction of the Department of Women of Southern California, First Ecclesiastical Jurisdiction, my home jurisdiction. Well, some of y'all know that I'm no longer living there, but it will forever be my home jurisdiction. And so we're excited to have her here today with us. Thank you, Sister Jasmine, for joining. I'm glad that we're going to be able to discuss this time together as we both
Yes.
interest in podcasting.
Yes, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the introduction and just everything. I'm glad to be able to talk about this topic here with you.
All right. Well, we're going to just lay out a few basics about podcasting as we think through some things about exploring the world of podcasting and some of the questions, the basic questions. We'll go to the next slide. The basic questions that we're going to think about today is who, what, where, and why. Who, what, where, and why. And we're going to kind of run through that together as partners in this time. Thinking about like how can you reach and run a podcast, some of the content, platform pieces. We'll get a little bit into how to record and how to distribute, and just the basic question of like why is it beneficial and how can you start as you're thinking about doing this work.
Yeah.
We'll go to the next slide.
Oh, is there background? Oh, our stuff. Oh, I'm sorry. You guys can hear the background noise?
We can hear a little bit of background noise there.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry. I'm in New York and moving around, so that's why. Is it yeah.
Oh yeah, we just had a little bit of a break up there. Well, let's talk about the Who. And Sister Jasmine, you could jump in as we're dialoguing. Uh, Thinking about the Who, like what are the things that we're trying to accomplish in podcasting? Is one of the reasons why podcasting is so beneficial, that it gets you access to beyond the walls of the church. Uh, there's so much that we hear in the preaching moment that sometimes we might say, "Huh, I got a question about that," or "Let me think about these moments," or the things that are happening in the church and the world around us. We want to explore what that looks like in the life of conversation, those things that you are having in the parking lot, those conversations you're having at home, those phone conversations and questions you're asking that you may not be able to ask the preacher in the moment. Those are things that podcasting can help you reach to. And Sister Jazz, you want to talk about a little bit of like some of the groups that we get to reach when we consider podcasting outside the four walls?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, I would say that you reach the people that are not in the walls of your church or that are
Yeah,
not
yeah.
coming to your church. You also reach the people that may have lost their way. And I don't want to say lost their way, but maybe they're not coming to the Sunday services as much. So now there's something else for them to grab a hold to. And then also just the members that are faithful that need a little bit more content, just faith-based content, because we know there's a wealth of stuff that's out there that's secular or that's not necessarily faith-based or not pushing us towards living for God. So just to have something else on our phones or something else on these social media platforms that is advocating, pushing us, giving us guidance, giving us good counsel, wise feedback on life. Like those are things that you would want for your members to have additionally outside of the preached word on Sunday.
Yeah, I think that's great. Yeah, the preach word in so many of our church contexts is exhortation, it's inspiration, it moves us into the week. But then there are things that we encounter during the week that we don't get to simmer on or ask questions of. And I think particularly when we think about our young adults, they are like living in a stream of content all the time, right? We are inundated with information. So how much more do we want the church to be involved in kind of bringing a little bit more refinement to all that information that is out there? So podcasting gives us that opportunity, like you said, to provide some of that biblical content that is more exploratory than it is just receiving. We can go to the next slide. So
Yeah.
context, yeah. Let's talk a little bit about context, like what you may not talk about over the pulpit. And as you're thinking about questions here, I guess the question I have for our audience is, what are some questions that you don't get to hear answered in the pulpit? To the extent that you are comfortable, like what questions do you ask when you're sitting in a church to yourself? What questions are you asking during the week? What are things you're like, huh, I don't understand that, or like, oh, I want to think more about that. Throw that in the chat so we have some context of what's the context you're living in. Because as we're thinking about the things that you don't talk about over the pulpit, these are opportunities where podcasting can create an environment or culture for that to happen.
Yeah, and I think additionally, how many times have we been sitting in a sermon or we've just received everything, but we did have questions? And you can't typically walk up to your pastor after all the time and have like a in-depth conversation about it, and then by the time Tuesday Bible study or Wednesday Bible study comes around, you maybe forgot about it, and then the next Sunday you you're on a whole different topic. So what the podcast can do is you can additionally expound on what was talked about in the pulpit. And then, like Elder Parham was saying, you can also talk about those things that may be a little nuanced where you're like, hey, I can't preach a complete sermon on this, but I can bring in maybe about 3 or 4 other people and we can have a panel discussion about it and get some different thoughts on it. So that's just another way to add value in the podcasting space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Sister Quinn here, like we definitely need more faith-based content. Yes, exactly. I'm excited to find content that is not inappropriate and does not have profanity and talks about biblical faith-based content. Uh, and I also think too, like to some of those things, what is not inappropriate, but also think about what are those things that people are afraid to ask in the church that maybe some of those spaces can be asked. Questions about politics, questions about race, as you're thinking about these things, question about finances, all those things are elements that a podcast can expand on or lead us into.
Yeah, I was gonna
Yeah,
say, do you want to start listing some of the possible
yeah, yeah.
touchy topics? But I think right now, I mean, we're all talking about politics, and it may not be beneficial for you to preach a message on how to vote or um, encouraging people on the biblical principles and how that should guide you when it comes to voting. You may not want to spend a series on that right now. It may not be something that you can work in, but that is something that you can put into podcast form and have that conversation. Like I said earlier, bring in a panel. You could also bring in politicians to help and push that conversation. That's another thing, just to think about when you're thinking about different types of episodes or guests to bring on. You may not want a politician in your pulpit, but you can definitely bring him on the podcast. If we're talking about mental health stuff, you may not want the therapist in your pulpit, but you can definitely bring him on the podcast and have a biblical backed conversation on it. So those are just some just different ideas on how the current times can also be, or you can influence your following with the current times and the biblical principles in this like new age medium.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. All right. We'll go to the next slide. So Jasmine, you want to touch in on this a little bit as we're thinking about where and like some equipment. I can talk about this as well as a person who's currently on a podcast, but would love to hear your thoughts too as we kind of bounce back and forth on what are the things we need and where should we be thinking about having these podcasts if we're considering that.
Yeah, so the cool thing now with technology is that you don't need a whole studio. You do not need to soundproof, the walls and stuff. You can simply, I don't want to say simply, but you can go on Amazon and look up podcast mics. The mics now have noise cancellation and you can kind of record wherever. So if you're thinking about doing podcasting, you're like, hey, maybe on a Sunday after church, we can dedicate about an hour and a half to record about 45 minutes, clear out your church. You guys can set up a table, put the mic in the middle. You definitely need a computer. I would say also get like a hard drive where you can store the episodes, and then you would simply hit record. And there's a lot of different platforms you can use. Buzzsprout is one. Most of the times on your computer, if you guys have MacBooks or Chromebooks, there's some type of device that not device, there's some program that you can use that's already embedded in your computer where you can record and you keep it there and then you just upload it basically to a platform. Like I said, Buzzsprout is a really good one and they're all pretty much the same. Okay, wait, can you hear me?
No, I think you went out there.
Okay, yeah, the you can use Buzzsprout to upload the and then where to record. Like that, you can use your church if you guys have a room, some rooms in the back or just on your campus, you can do that as well. And then if you also are renting out your campus, you can do something at the house where like you can just put it on the table, invite the people over, have them there, and work it that way. You can also get real technical with it and get your studio and get multiple mics and have the lights and the glitz and glam. But if you're just trying to start off and you feel like it's on your heart to start it, you don't need all of the works to make it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm currently on a podcast. I've been on one for the past 4 years called The Two Cities, and For us, just to give you an example, you don't all have to be in the same place, right? As you're engaging in conversation. For our team, we're literally across the country and literally all over the world. And so as you hear these voices on our episodes, these voices are literally in different time zones and on different sides of the country and the world, as we're thinking about that. So you're not limited. You actually get to open up the space that allows you to have guests on, talk through things, engage different cultures. Even as you're thinking about your church, how are you thinking about your church in relationship to the world that it sits in, right? Maybe not even in the local context, its neighborhood or its city, but how you're able to engage with the world. And podcasting gives you the opportunity really to be globalized in your approach and reach across the aisle with other folks as well. And so where you sit, you could be sitting in your house, you could be doing like I am right now, and engaging with someone who's sitting in their office 2 or 3 continents away. That's the power of being able to establish kind of the space that you're sitting in, and to what Sister Jasmine said, it doesn't have to be expensive. I do most of my podcasting via Zoom. We do recording, and also to talk about this as you're recording, there are a number of ways that you don't have to necessarily be live. There are some podcasts that actually are live and unedited. You can record your podcast and you can edit your podcast. So don't think that you have to be pristine as you're thinking about podcasting. There's ways that you can curate, edit, and many of the podcasts that you may be listening to right now, that's not a first run. That is after they have edited. That's after that they've thought through some things in which how they want to order the structure of their episodes. So those things come into mind too when you're thinking about recording. It doesn't have to be something you have to be nervous about as you're doing it in time. You can edit them as well. Anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I think that's a good point too, that it doesn't have to be live, because I know that that's a thing that a lot of people get nervous about, and they're like, oh, I don't want to have to speak live or do the Facebook live, but you can definitely pre-record, have someone go back and edit it, and put them up. You can also, a way to be effective is going in and recording multiple episodes in one day and then filtering them out that way. So you don't feel like every week we need to dedicate time to record an episode and meet together. So that's a way to be just effective and use your time wisely. And then you can, essentially knock out 3 to 4 episodes in one day. If you're doing 30-minute episodes, knock that out in one day. Now you have content for the rest of the month, and you equipped, or you've given your church, your consumer base, content for the month, and you only had to dedicate about 4 to 5 hours on one day getting it done. So that's a way, to look at it. I know a lot of us are like, have busy schedules, and we're like, well, how am I going to do all of this? But there are definitely ways to make it efficient, so that you're working smarter and not harder. Do you have any other like tips and stuff with maybe what you guys are doing with your podcast?
Yeah, I think also too, think about being thematic, right? Like in your podcast, who do you want to be? So I think that's something you also want to think about. Like when we were initially talking about where we were talking about physical location, but I would also say like ask the question, where do you want to be sitting in? Like where do you want to be giving input to or exploring or thinking through? Because as you're doing a podcast, there's certain genres of podcasts that kind of form out of our experience. And you want to make sure that people want to come back to your podcast or wanting to hear what you have to say. And I do think at times when you're constantly bouncing back and forth, and it becomes inconsistent to a certain degree, people lose interest, right? People go to certain podcasts for certain reasons, right? You go into the Jamal Bryant podcast if you listen to Jamal Bryant because of a certain way that Jamal Bryant is presenting, right? Whether it's the content itself, I'll let you ask that question because you're the one making that selection. But I think on the part of the person who's developing the podcast, you want to be intentional about the kind of content you want to put out, because that content is going to be associated with you and it's going to be associated with your church. And so what do you want your church to be speaking into or talking about? What do you want your church to influence? And I don't mean that becoming stars or anything like that. God bless you if you do, but you are influential with your voice. And remember that a podcast is audio, right? It is your voice putting something to it. And so where you sit and what you contribute to in the themes and the content does matter, because there's a lot of podcasting out there. And in one sense, to a certain degree, you don't want to just sound the same. You want to be able to be making some kind of contribution. As you know, kind of like we flip through channels of things that we are uninterested in. And then we sit on something that we've been drawn to and it's developing over time. And so even think about podcasting as it's a development over time. You want to lead people back into back into the next episode and into the next episode and into the next episode. It's not, I wouldn't say you're necessarily just trying to build a brand, but you want to make sure that what you're doing in your episodes matter, right? And the content that you talk about, you don't want to be rambling for an hour, because I can as easily press pause and go about the rest of my day. Right? and that's one thing you have to think about, because this is not a preaching moment. So even in that framing, imagine a podcast was a preaching moment, and if you weren't making sense, people got up and walked out. You would never want that to happen. So think about your podcasting as a moment in which you're communicating, and you want to communicate clearly, and you want to communicate for people to be drawn into what you're talking about. So think about your themes. Don't I would consider not bouncing around all the time. It's okay for that to a certain extent, but you want to be as consistent as you're going into some of the things that you're doing and talking about, so that people also too, when people say, "Hey, I listen to this podcast," and somebody says, "What is it about?" You want people to be able to say that what it's about, right? And not be like, "Oh, it's a bunch of people talking and praying," like no, you want them to understand why is it important to listen to this podcast. So themes, some of those things are helpful.
You do have to find your identity and how you want to show up in this space as a now podcaster. It's not the preaching moment, like you said. You're talking and giving value in a different space, and then also you're essentially, you could possibly be reaching people that are unchurched, so they want to hear maybe a more practical word or a more practical conversation and you're trying to win them over. So you definitely don't want to be on there praying and belaboring the whole time, because like Elder Parham said, people can easily just skip off. But if you are having an engaging conversation, or if you want to be known for that, because another thing is, if you have a lot of young people at your church, maybe you're like, hey, we could just give this over to the young people and they're gonna do their podcast, and we're going to allow them to do it. That appeals to a whole different audience than who you're appealing to. But you have to know your church, and also just figure out what vein you want to operate in. But that's another good idea. Or even if you're like, hey, we have a lot of women here, we want to do a podcast that is centered around women, and we're going to utilize them and dive on these topics. And then you can also do something that's seasonal. You're like, hey, we're going to give 4 episodes to the youth. We're going to give them about 6 weeks, and they do it. And then we're going to go to another ministry. We're going to go to the evangelists and see like, well, okay, and this is just my mind working, but we're going to have an episode with evangelists that are single women, or evangelists that are mothers. How are they navigating? Evangelists that are in their older age, how are they living? But those are just a few different topics, where now if you just look at that framework, you have 3 different episodes, and you can pull on the different people that are in your congregation to run those episodes. So like I said, it's not necessarily working hard, but you're working smart and utilizing the people in your church. I think that's another piece of it. Like, there's so many gifts in the body, and a lot of times, being in the traditional older church, it was like, okay, you can only do 1, 2, or 3 things. But if you're a good speaker, or you're a producer, or you're good with the camera, now you have a space in this ministry of podcasting. And now someone who may have felt like, I only have a place outside in my in the secular place, or with my job, I'm not really valuable here in the church. Now they feel like they can be valuable here now and value to doing, able to help push what the ministry is doing. So that's another thing to look at it, like how can we utilize people that don't necessarily have the gifts that the church has promoted in the past.
Yeah, I think that's great. And it does allow, to what you were saying, Sister Jasmine, allows people to develop their voices in different ways, right? And you don't have to develop your voice from the pulpit. You can develop your voice in conversation with someone else, and contribute in that way. And I think that comes to our next slide about the why. I think we've been touching on this a little bit, but the why, right? It gives more faith-based content outside of the Sunday service, and to know, like, this is not a Sunday service, so you don't have to start it out in this like structural way, like we gonna read a scripture, we gonna pray, we go have an offering appeal. It is not that kind of medium, right? And so to understand, let's use the tool in the way that it was built to glorify God, in the means that it provides, right? And sometimes we want to refine a tool to fit a mode that it wasn't built for. Podcasting is not inherently a place where preaching in the moment or preaching a sermon is going to be appealing to someone. By all means, I'm not saying that you can't have preaching involved in your content, because there are podcasts that are actually just rebroadcasts of church moments. But that's not the type of podcasting that we're talking about in this particular medium. We're talking about conversational podcasting, engaging maybe some of the things that were coming from the pulpit. So just a few ideas, right? It doesn't have to be tied to the church service. It can be tied to broader questions of life. One of the things we have to think about too is that much of the world doesn't live in this sacred secular type of mindset that we tend to live in as Christians, right? All of God's world is sacred. And so what an opportunity you think about when you start talking about some of the things that we did talk about, the whys of education in the lens of being a Christian, the whys of finances in the ways of being a Christian, the whys and why we engage politics as a Christian. Now, I'm not saying engage politics in a way that is partisan. I'm not even talking about that. But like, can we have a conversation of this why? Why do we engage politics? Why does the church matter? Why should we think outside of ourselves when we're thinking about community and social justice and all these things? Why does COGIC matter? Right? We got to get better at asking questions. Asking questions is not doubt. Asking questions does not mean I don't believe. If that's the case, let's just blow up the whole school system. Let's just let it go and everybody get a job. The whole point of the educational process is to learn, and the primary way in which you learn is by asking questions. How many of y'all sat in class before and said nothing because you don't understand anything, and then you walk out of the room and you paying good money for this educational moment, and you've learned absolutely nothing? Why? Because you didn't ask the question. And I'm just speaking personally myself. When I didn't ask the question, I found out, and finally, when I did ask it, 55% of the room had the same question I had. It just took that one person to ask why. Why? And so these are some of the things you want to think about. Why? Why? We're talking about why because it gives you the opportunity and space to think about the world that we live in, that the church is a part of too. So, how can your church provide faith based content to the average person who will never walk in your church, who might just be flipping through, Spotify? They see this thing, this episode. Oh, I want to listen to this episode. Oh, they talk about politics. Well, yeah, I'm geared up. I'm getting ready to vote for such and such. And then they hear this dialogue about how their faith shapes how they think about policies, or how they think about the decisions that are being made in Washington that are impacting how we live and breathe and are able to proclaim Christ in the world. And that why has led to them acting in a different way that glorifies God. may not ever step foot in your church, but they heard that content, they're still receiving from you, and they're learning how to be more like Christ in the world that they're going to have to engage every single day. So this gives that opportunity to do that well. It also gives opportunity for us to think, I think, in some ways about our faith at large, right? What I used to say, and nobody get mad at me on this, I'm proudly COGIC, but I also recognize that God must been doing a work in the faith of the church, because COGIC is barely 100 years old. So what can I learn from my other brothers and sisters who are walking with Christ? There's tons of opportunities for us to engage as globalized followers of Jesus, right? To learn from one another in this space. It's not bound by denomination or bound by a certain tradition, but that we are followers of Jesus Christ. So that gives you an opportunity there to do that as well, and be multi-generational too. When you think about these things, that'll also shape your content, right? If you go in, you need to understand the language too. Jasmine, you totally jump in on here. Understand the language too, because when you jump into a podcasting world, jumping in a global world. So speak like folks speak, right? To bring them in. So if you in there like, I'm tearing, I'm holding on, yet holding on. That's church language. And I'm not saying don't be the church, but if we're going to be evangelistic in some of our podcasting, we have to think about the language that the world who's going to be leaning into is going to understand. And that doesn't mean being a part of the world. That means understanding the world and shaping some of your content in a way that's easily understood. And that's very gospel centered. Jesus used parables. Jesus used common things that the people would understand. You got to do the same thing when it comes to content in your podcasting.
Yeah, I think so too. You said definitely a lot. I think there's so many of us. I know there's so many conversations about where the younger generation has went, or the millennial generation has went, especially in the Church of Christ. And I think a lot of those reasons as to why people have left, but I've heard is because they've asked questions and their questions didn't get answered. And there wasn't really a space for their questions to get answered. And I think this really does provide a space, especially for like Gen Z, because Gen Z is on a different level. They like, oh, you ain't answering my questions, I'm about to go where that is, or I'm gonna sit for church, or not just because it gives you an opportunity to answer those questions, to rectify some of the, I don't want to say hurts, but maybe just some of the disappointments that the younger generation may have, because there wasn't really a space. And then we know we all had our experiences where there was this notion of, oh, don't question God, and kind of saying it in the wrong context and making it seem as if you couldn't ask anything, you couldn't get clarification for anything. And this kind of gives you a space to where you can clarify certain things. We keep touching on politics, and it's like, yes, because there are people who need biblical backing for what they're going to do politically, right? And if we're not giving it to them, and not telling them who to vote for, what policies to vote for, but when you go into your alone time with God, or you are reading, there is a way to do certain things, and there is a way that God will also speak to you and urge you to vote or to show up in certain spaces. So that can be shared through the podcasting, and through the asking of questions, and developing conversations, and giving people a chance to not just hear what you're saying, but to be able to respond. And then if you do the live aspect, like how we have the comments that are on here, it gives you an opportunity to then answer questions in real time. And then another thing you can also do, if you're not going to do the live aspect, is have a question box, or you can set up like a Google form, have that maybe as a QR code at the church. Hey, if you guys have questions, submit it to this Google form, and we'll be sure to answer your questions at the end of the podcast, or we'll facilitate episodes on these questions that you've submitted. And that's a way to, one, get buy-in from your audience, your base, and then also make them feel like they're involved, make them feel like they're a part of this new project that you guys have going on at the church. So those are just some things to consider. And then you talked about voice and understanding like the current times. I think it's also important to lean on your members as well, and maybe even having a conversation before you start the podcast, like, hey, well, just what are some current topics, or what are some things you guys think we should discuss? Or you put out the episode and then after ask your members, hey, what do you guys think about this? Ask your young people, hey, does this sound like something that's cool and hip? Does it sound like something that your people would listen to? Would you send this to your friends? And if they give you feedback, then feedback on what would be more beneficial or what would be more popular in their friend groups, go back and see if you can change it. But do the super churchy, because I believe that the content that we have as believers and the way that we live is something that people will follow if we package it well. I think a lot of times we miss out on the packaging, or we fall short on the packaging because we want to be super churchy, and then people are like, oh, I don't want to do the church, but we still have a great message and a great life that should be lived. So I just want to get us to understand that, like Elder Parham was saying, like, yes, the message and the content needs to be strong and stuff, but the packaging also matters as well when we're trying to win people over. And because that's the first thing that they see is, and the first thing that they're going to hear is the packaging. But I'm we are all sitting here because we believe that the faith that we've chosen and the God that we've chosen is worth talking about and is worth living for. And we want other people to realize that too and to benefit from him. But sometimes those of us that are the mouthpiece, we just have to make sure that we're appealing to that crowd that we're going for. So definitely want to echo Elder Parham's sentiments in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, when we, I appreciate that, Sister Jasmine. I think too, when we think about the why, like there's power in asking a good question. There's power in asking a good question. And I think as a church, we should be good askers of questions. I believe that, like, and I think the Bible, I would say this, right, as we think about podcasts and maybe asking good questions, the Bible is the big answer to the question, why? Why should I trust and serve God? And God reveals to us the answer to the question, right? Like, and so even think about that when you're wrestling with, like, man, can I ask this question? Can I think through these things, right? The Bible in of itself is a big response to the question of humanity, right? Is a big response to the question, why should I not sin? It's a big response to the question, why should I care about others? It's all those things. It's the response to the questions that we as humans have in our minds. God provides an answer to the questions, which means God is okay with us asking the question. And so much so that through eternity, he keeps answering the question over and over again in different time periods, in different places, because he knows humanity is always about asking questions. And in some ways, that childlike faith can be embodied in the life of podcasting, where children ask a lot of questions, right? And sometimes, particularly in some of our traditional households, would be like, because I said so. And in some ways, that's just establishing authority. In other ways, it's not recognizing that honestly, the kid just does not know. Right? And so once you put some flesh on those bones, they'll operate in it a little bit better. And so I think podcasting can do some of those things there as well.
Yeah. And I think also additionally, because like you said, because I said so kind of denotes like, oh, maybe you don't have a good answer for me. So it also challenges the leaders, or those of us that would be on the podcast, to also get deeper in our word and to study more and to learn more about whatever the scope is, but for us to get those answers and to become confident in them, because if we're going to go and do an hour or 45-minute podcast, we need to know what we're talking about. We don't want to just be on there talking about, oh, just because God said this, you should do this, or because of this X, Y, and Z. No, have biblical backing, have context, the historical context, root words, go deep into your studies with that. A lot of people appreciate that when you're able to really show like, oh, Noah's Ark wasn't just a sunshine band story. that y'all were saying, you know, when I was little, like there's actual context and biblical principles and ways that I can now be edified in my life through that story. So now I'm hearing that through the podcast, but I think it'll also equip us as leaders to go deeper in the word as well when we're having to explain it to a group that is not necessarily just sitting in the pulpit, or I mean sitting in our congregation, that also may not even have the backing of being in the church their whole lives. And I think that helps us, helps everybody, you know. But it's a way, if you're thinking like, oh, this podcast is just only going to benefit the congregation, like, no, it can also help strengthen you too and get you deeper in your word, and just better with your answers, and more concise, and more excited too. You know, studying is an exciting thing if you allow it to be. So that's just another nugget of how it can benefit the leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we talked a little bit about the how, but we can get a little bit more specific in some of these things. There are a number of ways that we can do that. So, Jasmine, you want to touch in on that a little bit?
Yeah, I touched on it a little bit earlier, getting ahead of myself, but evenly distributing the work. So I talked about the ministries. If you do, you have a young adult ministry, you have a youth ministry, you have a men's department, women's department. Those are now 4 different groups that I've named, that I'm pretty sure we all have in our churches, or yeah, we all have them in our churches, and you can allow them to do some of the episodes. And I think it's a good thing because you're going to be providing a different level of just a different level of conversation if you're having those different groups be the leaders in these conversations. You can do it as one, you have one host that will be hosting these conversations, or you can also just do it in a way that where the episode is produced and you give the group, the panel, a list of questions, and they work through those questions as they are conversing. And you might want to give one person like the list of questions just to make sure that they keep the conversation going. Another way you can do it is have someone off screen that's asking the questions and they're answering it from the person that's behind the screen. Not everybody's voice that's being heard needs to be visible in the actual shot. If you are even doing a visible thing, because we talked about that offline, that it can just be simply audio. So if it's audio, then of course you can have the questions there, read through them, do whatever. If you guys do have someone who is going to be editing the episodes, you have a little more leeway with that. If you don't have anybody that's doing the episodes, let's try to make sure that we knock out the questions in a seamless way so that we're not stumbling over ourselves and stuff. So that's also something that you can ask your congregation. Like, does anyone in here have experience with producing? Does anyone in here have experience with putting together episodes, TV shows, conversations, facilitating conversations? That's another way to get some buy-in from someone that may not, you know, have had a place in the ministry in your church, and now they can come in here and be the producer of the podcast. So you don't have to do it all on your own. I would just say put some fillers out, even with the kids. Like, hey, the youth, what is it that you guys want to do? If one of the comments that they give back aligns with podcasting, put them in place. You know, of course, check their work and what they're doing, but definitely put them in place to help serve in that ministry. I think, did I kind of touch on what else would you add
No,
in the distributing of the work?
No, I think that's good. Really making sure that you build a team that can help shoulder. Even when I think about the podcast that I'm on, it's a lot of willing hands, right, that move those pieces forward. So we always have a consistent amount of team members in some way there, and that helps frame. And then we also have flexibility. So if one member can't be on or 2 members can't be on, you kind of build that in. Because we do have lives, right? And things happen, as one of the preachers I heard here said, life be lifing, sometimes. and when it's lifing, you need some other folks who can step in those moments when that's happening. So yeah, just keep those things in mind when you're developing a team, and you can spread that work out and be consistently well in the product that you provide. So this has been fun. I'm glad we've been able to do this. I know we have some
Yeah.
questions that are on here that hopefully we'll be able to answer for some folks. And again, if those who have joined on later, if you have a podcast episode that you already listened to, come on, put it in the chat so you could share that with folks. Yeah, Jamal Bryant. I haven't listened personally. I've seen clips, but I heard it's quite intriguing conversations. Yeah. Okay. Leadership podcast. That's great. And I know we talked about particularly kind of church related or faith based related, but there's so many genres, right? I listen to from time to time a number of things. Yeah, preaching and preachers. Martha Simmons. Okay. Yeah, this is new, and I encourage you that we got a couple. We got Superintendent Nathaniel Green on this one, the Preachers Podcast.
Yeah.
I think that's just really down to earth conversation, provoking.
Yeah.
New Life Live. Okay. All right. Yeah, that's
Reaching while black.
Preaching While Black. Okay. I'm gonna have to look that one up.
Right. What podcast do you? So I'm a fan of Preacher's Talk, where Superintendent Green, where he's on. I also listen to I'm like, why am I blinking? There's one, it's not a church one, but it's she's a Christian. Her name is Crystal Renee, and I think it's Keep It Sweet podcast. And she's just as a young female talking about her life. There's another one, it's called the Rooted Podcast. It's two Christian friends, they're Black women, and they just talk about their lives. One's single, one's married, and they talk about their friendships and stuff and just how to go through life. And they're very encouraging because I know a lot of times we as believers, as young believers, may not have people. So that's another reason why necessary too, so that people can know, like, hey, you're not alone. There are other people living, for God as well. And here are some practical tips, or just here is some transparency to help get you through, your day. Or like Elder Parham said, life be life. And so sometimes you just need to hear how life was life for somebody else and how they got through. And the podcast can just help you kind of see, like, all right, I can use some of the principles that they use to help get me through what I'm going through.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk about a little bit more broadly some of the things, some of my interests, I guess maybe a little bit of my nerdy interests. I'm a huge Titanic fan. For some of y'all, you may not want nothing to do with Titanic. I'm a huge Titanic fan. I'm a nerd, and I'm not just talking about the movie. The movie's all right. I'm talking about historical Titanic, the sinking, all those things. I've been intrigued by that for decades, literally decades. So I chime in on a couple podcasts. There's a few out there called, if you're interested, Unsinkable, the Titanic podcast. I enjoy that as well. As I mentioned, I'm on a podcast myself, and at times I'm not always on the particular episode, so I enjoy being on there as well. It's called The Two Cities, which we touch on culture, discipleship, and theology, basically. And so there's a number of things that we touch on in that space. Also, my background is in higher education administration. So I've listened to a couple higher ed podcasts, higher ed jobs podcast, which is not just about jobs, but it talks about content of like the industry as well. And so those are some of the things that I think as I broaden like my portfolio, even thinking through, and I got some pointers from some folks here too. Yeah, John Maxwell is quite known in the leadership world, so it's good to hear from that. There's a couple of theology ones too, called one's called Theology in the Raw. It's kind of multifaceted in the sense that it talks about a number of theological topics. Sometimes the jargon can be a lot. That's okay. You're learning a few things there, and sometimes it's just very simple. So you have that, and then there's another one called it is called 5 Minutes in Church History. You want to know a little bit about church history? Yeah, in a little short vignette, you can listen to that, and it'll talk about a number of topics. Like it'll talk about particular early church fathers, early church mothers in the like first 100 years of the life of the church. So think about that. I mean, we have writings about the church and big topics 100 years ago that still have implications today. Even when we think about some of the things that are happening with the Black Israelites, Hebrew Israelites, you could look towards those early church fathers as an argument and say, like, hey, this thing called Christianity is not a Eurocentric white religion. We got writings from Northern Africa and around the world.
Yeah, that's a whole different episode. Yeah, so I see Lady Quinn's question about Mount Sinai. So yes, we did start a podcast. We are working through some stuff. You know, Mount Sinai, we have a lot going on. So working through some logistics of basically what we were talking today, to make sure the scheduling is right. So that's like my next order of business, is try to make sure we're working smarter and not harder. But that's basically what I was sharing today, is how we are going to facilitate that podcast, is utilizing different ministry leaders, utilizing different people in the church. I'm of course not the leader of the church, so they've allowed me to come, one of the people gifts and talents that, maybe 10 years ago or 2-3 years ago may not have been able to have been used in the church, but they've allowed me to come in and utilize my expertise and come in and facilitate this project. So I'm definitely grateful. And just a word to leaders, like I'm on the other end of a leader trusting a younger person to facilitate or to bring the gifts that I have that are not necessarily in the church. I know with my great grandmother and my grandmother, when they had me on the altar, they didn't think I'll be doing content and branding workshops for the Church of God in Christ. They just knew, we just want her to be a part. But because I've now, gotten into a ministry where they, see value in the younger people and see value in doing other things. As a 29-year-old, I feel very secure here, and I feel like I can use my gifts here, and I'm willingly using them here. So just a word to the leaders: utilize your young people, allow them to come in and definitely teach them, because I'm learning how to deal with people, learning people skills and working, but also bringing value to the church. So that's how we're working through that, and that's just want to leave that with the leaders. But that's how Mount Sinai is facilitating our podcast. You want to did you want to touch on that question, or did
yeah,
you
I can touch on that question a little bit. I think there's a couple answers to this. Can a YouTube video be viewed as a podcast? Yeah, absolutely, it can. And there can be a blend between the two. Something that we didn't talk about today is that we're starting to see more of an integrative podcasting by means of video. So if you pull up some podcast episodes on platforms, there's actually a video alongside it. So some folks are framing their podcasts as a video conversation turning into a podcast. Are they exactly the same? No, I don't think they're exactly the same when it comes to the content and the framework, but you can use both as a means to do that. So that's totally fine. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. People.
We talked about it all. Don't allow that to stop you. So you can also, there's plenty of platforms. There's Apple, there's Spotify, there's Google. I think there is, there's Google Podcast, Spotify, Love Heart, where there's simply audio. YouTube is basically one of the main platforms for the video, but if you are wanting to start a podcast, you can definitely strictly go visual. You don't need to buy the cameras, because of course it's a lot more money, and then you need a camera operator. You don't want the people to come in and edit the videos, so that's a little bit more work. But you can definitely start with solely audio, and it won't, people won't be like, oh, I can't, see y'all or whatever. Like, they'll still accept the audio element that you're offering.
That's awesome. Well, I think that is all the questions that we have on here. This has been fun doing this alongside you as we're talking about it. I hope it's stoked some curiosity for those of you who have been watching, and those of you who will share for the others that are watch. This is a great opportunity for us to continue to use the tools that God puts before us. Right, anything that's in the world can be used rightfully to the glory of God, right? So just remind ourselves of that. Remember, my thought has always been, that one-eyed devil TV is the very means of the things that we've been doing, right? That I ain't going online when the pandemic hit, right? All these tools, right, we use to God's glory. So this is just another
Yeah.
opportunity to use a tool to God's glory in a medium. So
Yeah.
we're happy that we've been able to dialogue today. Thank you, Sister Jasmine, for your expertise in this. And we look forward to seeing the podcasts that are going to come out.
Yes.
We
Power up.
appreciate you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Glad to just be opening the eyes of the saints. They've, we born and raised in the church, so they poured so much into us. So it's a blessing to be able to pour back into these ministries and these leaders as they are navigating these, new territories sometimes. So definitely reach out. You guys see, Elder Parham, I'll let you say if they can reach out to you.
Oh yeah,
But if you want to reach out and you have questions or whatever about the podcast, about podcasting or how to get off the ground, resources, definitely reach out and let us know so we can help you guys get these podcasts off the ground. Because people need them. People want to hear what you guys have to say. So we're here to support, and I'm definitely grateful to be back on Power Up and sharing here.
And I would say before we close out, don't be surprised if you see a podcast coming out from #PowerUp. You
Right.
never know what God may be doing.
You never know. You
in the
never
future.
know.
So hey, we are thankful for you. Thank you for joining us today, and look forward to you joining us next week. Please, #PowerUp is a weekly boost that we have every single week. So join us next week. We are thankful for you all, and remember that God is continuing to do work in the world. This is a mechanism by which we can do that great work. So thank you, Sister Jasmine, again, and thank you all for watching. We'll see you all next week.
Thank you so much for joining us today. #PowerUp is part of the learning and development arm of the International Sunday School Department of the Churches of God in Christ. We invite you to sow into this ministry. Your gift in any amount will help us continue to share leading edge biblical educational solutions and leadership tools to churches, districts, missions, and jurisdictions of all sizes. Along with our president, Mark Ellis, we are aiming to continue to reach, teach, minister, assimilate, build, and involve people for the furthering of the kingdom of God. Furthermore, we want to eradicate biblical illiteracy. Your gift in any amount makes you part of this effort as well. God bless you in advance for your gift. We pray that the Lord richly blesses you.